Welcome to the Cybersecurity Summit podcast at Summit Conversation.
By all means, don't hesitate to jump in, ask questions, and let's have a conversation. So I want to start with, actually, bear with me a minute. I got to close the door. I have large dogs that get very loud at times, so I have to close my door to make it a little less intrusive. So a little bit about me. I want to kind of start at the beginning of my career. Actually, I started my career in the U.S. Army, and actually I was focused on kinetic threats. Spent a lot of time in, attack aviation regiments. Specifically, spent a lot of time in H-64 Apache helicopter regiments. Was part of a group that actually introduced the Apaches into the Korean Peninsula. Went on in my career to work through and get into a little special operations group. We actually provided all the aviation assets for all the black ops for all of the different branches of the U.S. military. So it was a really enjoyable, interesting time of my life. But it also happened to be a time in my life where, the Army, I'm going to date myself a little bit. But it was a time where the Army really wasn't using or didn't kind of grasp the idea of the internet yet. So it was they were trying to figure it out. And I happened to be in a little organization in the middle of Texas at the time, and they came around and dropped in a T1 and said, "Here, go do something with it." So myself and one other person were assigned an additional duty of go build a network. And I'd say, okay, let's learn how to build a network, and then let's learn how to pull together all the PCs in the environment and put them on that network. And then it became let's support this now. So it was an interesting time in my career, and I started getting to a point to where I kept doing more and more of this, though I was trying to get further and further out with what I thought was the really exciting, fun stuff. And I couldn't get there. So I got to a point where I was like, okay, well, if this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to do. And I started embracing it. I got out of the Army. I actually went back to school for a little bit, finished off a degree, and then dove headfirst into cybersecurity. And I will tell you, one of the things why cybersecurity in particular is, it goes back to the beginning of my career overall, where you had a defined adversary that you were working against. You had to know how they operate, what they do, and why they do what they do. And that's something that's kind of carried through in my career, is just that importance of understanding who's on the other side of that threat. All right, so kind of going forward, I got finished up a little bit of schooling, dove into consulting. I started actually with building out and securing infrastructure for online organizations. It was actually in the dot-com boom era, where everyone was throwing up websites and kind of creating their own little marketplaces to do different things. And so I dove into that, did it for a while, and actually was with Arthur Andersen at the time. And Arthur Andersen kind of had some issues and fell apart. So as that organization dissolved, I took another shift where I decided, well, I'm going to go dive into doing a little bit of IT audit. So I joined an organization and built out an IT audit group, which, from my personal experience, one of the things that was most important and most impactful to me was that time in audit. It took me out of the core technical work and really was a great way for me to connect the dots between what we do from a technical security perspective and the goals, objectives, and imperatives of an organization. So it really tied together, what an organization does to generate revenue, why they do it, and really kind of create that balance between risk and reward. And understanding, you can't manage every risk. So you have to be very careful and very selective on where you focus to be able to enable the organization to accomplish what it wants to accomplish. So I dove from there, and then, spent a little bit of time, dove back into external consulting. Was actually at a time where the U.S. Sarbanes-Oxley Act had just been passed, and I mean, it was like you couldn't find enough people who understood Sarbanes-Oxley compliance. So everyone was looking for people to help them become compliant. So spent a little bit of time doing external consulting, helping organizations manage through that compliance. Also got to a point where I realized, the compliance piece is just not what I want to do. So I kind of ended that, and I joined a little organization that at the time just happened to be spinning off from Cargill, a company called the Mosaic Company. And I joined there and built out their security program and served as the CISO there for about 12 years. At the end of those 12 years, they had some choices to make, whether I wanted to stay in the Minneapolis area or move with the company as they were moving out of the Minneapolis area. And I like it where I live. So I chose to leave the Mosaic Company and I actually joined Cargill. Now, why Cargill? And I'll tell you a little bit about the role that I'm in here. First and foremost, like Michelle was mentioning, Cargill is a very large, complex organization. It's probably the largest organization that no one knows about, because it's predominantly, behind the scenes and creates and works in a space that is very logistical. We provide inputs to so many other products that you see on the shelf, that the products, the company that actually produces those, but you don't know our role in the production of those products. So Cargill is very large and complex. It does everything from, grain trading to edible oils production. So you think about canola oil, rapeseed oil, sunflower oil. I mean, we do a lot of that production, to creating emulsifiers, texturizers, inputs to like beauty products. We actually create an additive that goes into asphalt that makes asphalt reusable. So it's incredible the broad range of products that are produced here. Now, a little bit about my role. So kind of circling back to the areas that I find most passionate. And it's really those threat areas. So I had an opportunity to dive into a very large, complex organization and narrow my focus down to the places that honestly I have a lot of fun with. So those areas, it starts with cyber intel, understanding adversaries, understanding how they work, why they work, and really the goals. We have resiliency, so business and IT resiliency. How do you prepare for those disruptions? We have vulnerability management, obviously looking through the environment and inventorying and managing out technical vulnerabilities across the landscape. We have e-discovery, litigation support, and internal investigations. So all of our forensics work, collecting information that's used in, again, litigation and internal investigations. We have all the offensive security, so attack penetration testing, adversary emulation. We have all of our security monitoring, so collecting all the data, doing security analytics, and turning that data into alarms for indicators of what could be potential security incidents. And then we have that 24/7 monitoring, and we do it, again, we split between the Minneapolis area and Bangalore in India, where we do our 24/7 monitoring and incident response processes. So that's a quick overview of me and my background and my role here. Just questions you have there. All right. So I'll dive into, I've already kind of touched base on how I got into security and some of the drivers of that. Dive into a little bit about, as a person newly into the space and kind of diving into it, first and foremost, the thing that I would say is, it's a very large, complex area to go into. There's so much you can do in it. The first thing that I would say you have to do as you step into security is figure out really what drives you and where do your passions lie when you start thinking about security. Because there's a whole lot you can do. Everything from security architecture to security product and support. You think about teams that just simply focus on managing and maintaining the different security tools. It can be a lot of fun doing that, but it's a very defined skill set that you need for that. You can also go into, one of the other teams that I have is we have our own development group that focuses very specifically on security orchestration, automation, and just kind of maintaining some of our platforms. So you think about that. That's again another area that can be a lot of fun, but you have to have very specific skill sets. And some of the skill sets obviously are, it starts with development. Scripting is a very important part. And when I start talking about scripting, it starts with, learning Python. Python is such an incredibly flexible scripting language that it will serve you in pretty much any role across security. Another one of the groups that I have are threat hunting. Threat hunters, and they spend a lot of time just creating Python scripts just to kind of dive through some of the data that they have to work on. We use Python for doing a lot of our security orchestration. So it's just extremely flexible. And also, kind of diving into some of the scripting, another thing that is important to understand is PowerShell. And, between the combination of PowerShell and Python, there's nothing you can't accomplish. And oh, by the way, this is also, these are the exact same tools that adversaries are using as well. So, between PowerShell scripts, Python scripts, they're using the exact same things. So the more you understand about how these tools work, the better you can understand how to actually combat some of what's going on. So kind of diving in again a little bit more, first find what your passions are, and then find what your interests are for learning. Scripting and coding is not for everyone. But if it is for you, dive into it, embrace it. If it's not for you, understand, really where those things are. I talked a little bit about, my own career, some of the areas where I dove into audit and some of the compliance space, understanding risk and risk frameworks. That's another incredibly important skill set. But again, it's one that so when you dive into risk is something that it's more of a mental exercise than a tangible technical exercise, because you are talking about something that you have levels of interpretation on when you get into risk, and being able to figure out how do you take those levels of interpretation and root them in some tangible facts. It's a really important skill set. And honestly, one of the things that I look for very specifically in team members is the ability to put logical arguments around risk. One of the things I've seen in my career, and one of the pitfalls people fall into, is looking at risk as the absence of a control. Well, and the way it plays out, and I see it most often when you get into kind of audit cycles, you get into an audit cycle where you get this risk of, well, user access isn't reviewed. And if user access isn't reviewed, it may be inappropriate. Well, what does that mean from a tangible risk perspective? Being able to step into it a little bit more and say, here are the points of user access that matter most. And oh, by the way, if you're not reviewing and if you're not making sure that access is appropriate, you have the potential for this data to be at risk based upon the access you're talking about. So taking a little bit further into, the purpose of some of those controls. It's a skill set that is extremely valuable, and it's one that will serve you well, whether you go into a technical path or even in a non-technical path. Understanding risk and being able to articulate risk with tangible value, it's an incredibly important skill. And one of the things when I start stepping into risk and start talking about risk with others, for me, it all starts back with when I was in the military. So I did a lot of mission planning and kind of crafting operational execution plans for different types of missions. So when you go into it from a military standpoint, one of the first things you do when you go into mission planning is you have to define what an acceptable loss is. Now, when we start talking about in the military, we're talking about lives. And you have to define what is acceptable loss in this mission to allow you to keep going forward. Now, you translate that into a more business operational perspective, and you're talking about dollars. Being able to step into it from the understanding that you're going to lose things when you accept risk. You run the potential of losing things. It could be intellectual property, it could be market share, it could be tangible dollars. And even market share, it all translates into tangible dollars that you put at risk. But being able to understand operationally, it's okay to step into something and say, you know what, we're going to take this risk, and the upside may be X, but the downside may be Y. And being able to actually put that into the context of dollars and understand that you can't avoid all risk. So you have to come to a point where you can tangibly talk through, okay, this risk is tolerable because we're only at risk for this much, because you cannot remove all risk from an environment. So technical skills, understanding scripting. Non-technical skills start with understanding risk, but it also goes with understanding communications and understanding people, because despite what it looks like from an external perspective, security is all about people, because it's human behavior, it's influencing people, and it's also understanding that there is a mind on the other side of these threats. There are people that have behaviors, and understanding behaviors, both the ones you want to influence and the ones you want to protect against. It is critically important to make sure that you're successful in your career. Because, oh, by the way, when you go into the security field, you're not on your own accomplishing something by yourself. You are part of a team that, oh, by the way, guess what? It's people. So being able to interact and be able to work with people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, and different opinions on what works and what doesn't work. Being able to work through how do you step into conflict and manage through conflict in a productive way, because you can absolutely manage through conflict in a very back and starts understanding, oh, this is what you meant by that, and this is what I meant by this, and being able to find an agreeable solution, or you end up going into risk as a very toxic perspective. And I've seen both. And when you step into managing people in conflict from a toxic perspective, it just creates damage, and you cannot be successful in an organization like that. All right, I think I'm back. Teams just glitched on me there.
You're back.
Right, we can hear you now, Paul.
The last thing I just want to kind of go through my monologue is around the things that keep me up at night, things that I worry about most. And honestly, I will say I don't like the context of keep me up at night, because I mean, you have to find a little bit of balance. And for me personally, there was a point in my career, where when I got out of the Army, and my very first project in a non-military type of environment was, I was working on a project where I was doing consulting for a very large Oracle implementation. And the implementation was not going well. And I was stepping in to help them kind of get it back on track. But really interesting moment where it was myself and another person who had just kind of separated from the military as well. We're working on this project. We're in this room one day, and we just happen to look at each other and we say, you know what? We could have a really bad day today, and no one's going to die as a result of that. So part of what we have to do within the security industry is we have to check ourselves a little bit with the reality of what's at risk. I mean, for the most part, there are certain scenarios, especially when you get into like plant manufacturing and some of the safety systems around, operational technology, where lives could be at risk. But understanding where lives are at risk versus where reputation, money, less tangible things are at risk, it's a really important thing. And we have to make sure that we ground ourselves in the reality that we're not saving the world in cybersecurity. Yes, we are protecting our organizations, and we have to take that very seriously. But it's not to a point to where you take your own mental health, your own physical health, and really put that burden on yourself that is not healthy. So we have to find healthy balance with how we look at what we do. So what really concerns me more than anything is the fact that there are people on the other side of this equation. They're really smart people. And when you look at the cybercrime space in particular, cybercrime is such a profitable business. And because it's so profitable, they're innovating. They continue to innovate at a very fast pace because there's an incentive for them to innovate. So the question that I constantly ask myself is, are we keeping pace? Because the only way that we can actually be effective at what we do is by keeping pace with the rate of innovation that the other side, the adversaries, are operating at, because they're fast. They're fast, but you know what? They're also human. They make mistakes too. So our ability to understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and oh, by the way, think a little bit deeper into, okay, we see what they're doing here now, but what are they going to do next? And I will tell you just some of the evolutions that you see are, a long time ago, it all started off with, pushing malware. And it was just, that was the name of the game. We're pushing malware. We're going to get in. It's going to operate as a worm. It's just going to kind of do its own thing on its own. Then it started evolving over time to, as defenses started ramping up to be more effective against just strict malware, it started shifting into, we're going after identities. So, taking over identities, cracking passwords, gaining access. And oh, by the way, from a defensive perspective, that meant, well, we're going to push out multi-factor authentication. We're going to get stronger passwords. Well, stronger passwords worked for a while, but the ability to crack passwords and then also it became a shift from just cracking passwords to we're doing credential harvesting. We're going to get people to log into fake websites and capture those credentials as they're logging in. And then, oh, by the way, so then the attacks shifted from not only credential harvesting to actually MFA bypass and MFA interception. So you think about the early iterations of MFA were all SMS-based MFA. So, oh, by the way, guess what the attackers did? Well, they started doing a SIM swapping and SIM duplication. So SIM hijacking. So I can stand up a phone that will mirror your mobile device. So by the way, when you get that message, guess what? It's coming right back to me too. They also evolved their tactics to take credential harvesting one step further. And we've actually seen this used in different attacks where they'll stand up a lookalike site that will mimic a corporate portal. It will also mimic the MFA prompt for that corporate portal. So what they do is, they'll not only capture your password, but then they'll also prompt you for that MFA prompt. They'll capture that, and then it's a matter of you have a time window to then leverage those credentials to log in as that user. And they do it. So, and now we're seeing the next evolution of this where you're seeing, the criminal marketplace actually stand up multi-factor authentication bypass as a service. So you no longer have to actually create anything. You just have to sign up for their own service that they focus on and specialize in helping other criminal organizations bypass multi-factor authentication. So it's this constant, are we staying ahead of it? What is going to be the next thing? Is our MFA keeping pace? Are we at a point where we're not exposed to some of the next evolution of attacks? I mean, that's a large part of where I put my focus and my energy is making sure I understand not only what attackers are doing today, but what are they going to do tomorrow, and how are we better prepared for what they're going to do tomorrow. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about what's in my head. I want to open it up to questions from the group now. Where do you want to go?
Okay, I have one quick question. So you said you worked on Blackhawks, and I'm sure that was very fun to do, but what was your favorite part of your job experience so far?
Favorite part of my job experience. That's a really hard one. I have to split that a little bit. When I was in the military working with some of the special ops groups, just some of the most dedicated professional people I have ever worked with in my life. I mean, it was just incredible, the people. And actually going into my career in cybersecurity, honestly, it's the same thing. It's the people. The thing that, so for me personally, where my career has gone, the thing that I absolutely love the most is building and enabling teams that do really incredible things. So finding people smarter than me, putting them in a position to do really smart things, and supporting them and giving them what they need, and just kind of helping build those teams. That is something that is just incredible, because it's, I can't emphasize it enough. Watching smart people do smart things and helping facilitate that, it is so rewarding.
Oh, I have
What's
a question. You mentioned some of the technical skills you'd learn, Python and PowerShell. Are those skills that are, I mean, if you didn't get them in school, and some of these people, some of the interns started with just, with not just, but with more of the computer science background, is that something they should focus on now and get some training in before they pursue?
100%, absolutely. I mean, there's so many free online means for learning scripting that, I mean, it's incredible how much is out there. And I would highly encourage, whether you go into it full time or not, simply understanding the potential of what can be done with some of those scripting languages. It's just great knowledge to have.
And then to follow up on that, so the technical skills like scripting, you can take a class in. How do they advance their understanding risk and risk-taking skills, managing risk skills?
Honestly, there's a whole lot. There are opportunities to go through different training on risk management as well. Part of what risk, it becomes a little bit more nuanced. And the hard part about understanding risk is you have to really be in an organization and really kind of understand a little bit about how they work to truly take the academic structure and theory of risk and put it into a practical application. Now, I would say there's a whole lot out there as well. I mean, the coolest thing about this space is there is never a shortage of resources, both free and paid for, that you can just dive into and learn. I mean, there's lots of, one of the things that I would start with is look at the SANS Institute. The SANS Institute, not only do they have, paid for courses, but they have a whole lot of very free, very engaging and informative free summits that they do. And they're always awesome to listen to. They have a lot of very, very skilled people who present topics and education as well. And they talk about what's actually working in industries and really some of the challenges within those industries as well. So that's one resource I would say absolutely go take a look at it and start with just some of the free summits that are available. Hear the topics, just kind of take all that in.
Just one quick follow-up question. Speaking of free sessions and things, the summit has a full day of free technical sessions for people, and that you're actually helping us develop. So is that a topic we should be developing as a technical session? That's a side note, but just planting a nugget.
I think that would be really good. We should have a little bit of a couple different nuanced areas. One of which is maybe we spend some time diving into beginner, intermediate Python scripting.
Paul, there's a question in the chat. ACIF is in a loud area and can't really ask it, so I'm just going to read it to you. He writes, certain legal instructors consider attacks on state infrastructures that are critical at a certain level as use of force. But unfortunately, there is no agreed definition of what is a critical infrastructure. How would you define these infrastructures that can be considered critical for a state?
Oh, that's a really complicated. That's a complicated topic. I mean, there's no other way to put it, and it's a very sensitive topic as well. The definition of critical infrastructure, every government around the world is creating their perspective on that. And although they differ within nuances, in reality, they fall back on a couple of the key pieces. When you look at any government around the world, there's a few very important components to their infrastructure, power, gas, oil, water, those things that support and sustain the ongoing economy and welfare of the people of that nation. I can't overlook also, financial services. Those are areas that they're critical for the viability of any country. I track a lot of what happens in that geopolitical space and specifically the geopolitics of technology and how the implications of it. It is it's a complicated mess, to be honest. And there's no real clear definition. And what you see in this space in particular, there is a ton of political posturing by different countries on this topic in particular. So my definition of it is kind of irrelevant. Though I will say, you know, when you look at what's being said and what's happening across this geopolitical space, countries are anchoring on what is the infrastructure that is critical to the ongoing economic viability and sustainability of the people of that country. And it's becoming more and more of a political issue and more of a, I want to call it a bargaining chip in the geopolitical dynamic that we're in today.
Well, I would think Cargill would be kind of in that mix because of the food production that you are involved in. I mean, to me, that could also be considered a critical infrastructure for a country is, you know, food.
The food and agriculture supply chain is absolutely one that is considered more and more critical around the world. It is because of the geopolitical dynamics that we're in today. It is one of those topics that is most sensitive internally.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna lie, it's not an easy world that we're in today.
Thank you.
Now, I will say one of the things that benefits us from the geopolitical dynamic is unanimously countries around the world understand the importance of feeding people. And from the broader geopolitical dynamic, food and agriculture has been kind of set outside of that for the most part. I mean, we have a lot of, you know, agreements around the world where, you know, countries have come together and said, yep, we're gonna carve this out, and we're not going to use this in that geopolitical dynamic and not use it as a bargaining chip in their political posturing, which has been really good, because the implications, if food becomes part of that political dynamic, it becomes a weapon. And that's been one of the agreements across countries around the world, is not to use food as a weapon. They use financing as a weapon against different countries. And that's honestly, that's one of the bigger areas where you start talking about that geopolitical dynamic. The financial markets are by far the most dynamic and really the most difficult areas. So great question, very complicated one. Sorry, go ahead. You
a bit different. So you were talking about, you were kind of choosing different employees, or you were sort of creating a team so you say you have amazing people that can create amazing things. Right now, I think not just me, but people in my environment, we are struggling with deciding what path of cybersecurity we want to involve ourselves in. I think, as you said, it's a very extensive world, and right now when we have that knowledge from computer science background, as Eileen said, or just a general cybersecurity background that we start after we finish college. We're also struggling on how can we decide what path we want to perhaps follow after we finish that. We finish college, perhaps starting in a company. How would you recommend, based on the experience you had, such as collecting a very talented group? How would you identify the potential perhaps members that you think are contributing because they have the skills, they have that knowledge, that they're really motivated for them to start?
So identifying potential talent, you know, the first thing I look for is curiosity, because this is one that will serve you very well in the security space, is just inherent curiosity and willingness to learn. And also the understanding that we are always constantly learning in this space. I've been doing cybersecurity for 25 years. I am always learning every single day something new, and being able to step into it, and I look for people who understand that as well and are willing to dive in and spend the time learning. Now, to figure out what is the right step into it and where you want to go with your career, first and foremost, understand when you step in, you're stepping in. Me personally, I would have never expected my career to go where it did. I honestly, when I started my career, I was dead set on I was going to be out shooting actively within the Army and just stay there. And I didn't do that. It shifted. There were different things that I saw an opportunity, and I went down that path. And every step of the way, it's been, that looks like an interesting opportunity. Let's go down that path and let's learn it. I've stepped in and out of technical roles throughout my career. So you have to be willing to do that. Now, when you start, what I would say is first you have to figure out, first and foremost, do you want to go down a technical path or a non-technical path to begin with? Doesn't mean that has to be the entirety of your career, but where are your core strengths that you bring as a start, and where are your core interests? For me personally, one of the things that I would say, if you want to just dive in and learn, just drinking from a fire hose, I would say start with looking at how do you move into like a security operations center role. So honestly, this is a space where you have the potential to learn more faster than anywhere else, because if you get into an organization that is really doing security operations, monitoring, and incident response well, you're going to be exposed to so much very quickly and expected to learn a lot as you go. And this is going to give you a little bit of experience in one, seeing how attacks actually happen, seeing how the different tools in the environment work and how they can be used. You'll start understanding a little bit more about architecture and how just technology works and how it connects together. And then it'll also give you a little bit more exposure as you go through that into, okay, what does risk management actually look like? Because part of even when you step into like a tier 1 SOC analyst perspective, you're going to have some level of interpreting what is the risk of whatever it is you're working on at the moment. And it's going to come through in the form of just, okay, what priority of a ticket this becomes and how do you prioritize what you're working on. So it's an opportunity to dive in and just learn so much so fast. But if you also have a really strong desire to learn more development practices, I mean, look at roles that are more on that lines of security orchestration automation and dive into that. It's still going to be an opportunity. You'll gain a lot more of the focused development practice, but you'll also understand how development supports the broader security goals and objectives, and it will expose you to more as well. So, bottom line too, when you step into it, find what is most exciting to start with. Understand it's a start. Don't think that it's going to define your entire career, because you will have lots of opportunities to change and adjust your career as you go through it. But step into it with the willingness and desire and drive to learn.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for your time. We're at 8:50 a.m. right now. So thanks so much for your insights, your journey, and taking questions. And the interns, thanks so much for attending today's session and being engaged and asking Paul your questions. It was just a great session. So thank you so much, everyone.
I really enjoy it. Thank you for connecting. And oh, by the way, if you're up for it, connect with me on LinkedIn. Follow me on
Yes.
LinkedIn.
Yes.
We'll stay connected. And if you have questions or, come across something that looks interesting, you want feedback on it, by all means, reach out.
Okay. Have a great weekend, everyone, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today at the Cybersecurity Summit podcast. See you next week. We invite you to join our Cyber Pro community on LinkedIn at Cybersecurity Summit.